Welcome back, and in this lesson I want to introduce a really important AWS service, and that's Identity and Access Management, known as IAM or IAM. Now I have a whole section of the course dedicated to this service later on, but for now I just want to introduce it. Now I want to make this lesson as brief as possible, so let's just jump in and get started. To understand why IAM exists, we need to understand the current identity situation of the AWS accounts that you've created for the course so far. The accounts that you've created have an associated account root user, and the account trusts this user fully. This is why the account root user has full, unrestricted access to the account. Now, the AWS account and the account root user can really be thought of as the same thing. The account root user gets created with the account and it can't be restricted in any way. In most real-world situations, you want to be able to grant other people in your organization access to your AWS account. This might be users, groups, or even applications which they create or manage. And you generally want to restrict the access that these people, groups, or applications have. It's always best practice to only give the permissions required to do a job or perform a task, and this is called least privileged access. Only having a single identity in the account is also problematic. If the credentials are ever leaked for the account root user, then the damage could be account-wide. Remember, it's not possible to restrict the permissions or the access rights that the account root user has, and so if the credentials are leaked, then potentially all regions and all services in those regions are at risk. What we need is a way to allow more control over what access is given to our AWS accounts, and that is where IAM comes in handy. Every AWS account comes with its own running copy of IAM, its own database. Now, IAM is a globally resilient service, so any data is always secure across all AWS regions. Remember that one because it'll probably feature on the exam. But also understand that the IAM that you see in each of your accounts is your own dedicated instance of IAM, separate from other accounts and from anyone else's accounts. Your AWS account trusts your instance of IAM. IAM, like the account root user, can do anything in the account. Now, there are some restrictions, but this is generally around billing control and account closure. Operationally, the IAM of your account is trusted fully by the account, and so IAM as a service can do as much as the account root user. Inside IAM, you can create other identities. So there are different types of identities and you can create many of these. So you're not limited to the single account root user anymore. You can create multiple identities, and IAM can allow these identities to do certain things. Now, because a single AWS account trusts IAM, if IAM allows one of the identities that it manages to do something, the account automatically trusts that identity in the same way that it trusts IAM. And I'll show you how this works when I talk in more detail about access rights and permissions as we go through the course. Let's quickly look at some of the different things that IAM lets us create. IAM lets you create 3 different types of identity objects. We've got IAM users, IAM groups, and IAM roles. They each have their own specific uses, and by the end of this course, I'll make sure that you really understand when to use each. But at this stage, I just want to quickly introduce them. Now, users represent humans or applications that need access to your AWS account. If Bob from accounting needs access to AWS billing, or Jane from infrastructure needs access to create and terminate EC2 virtual machines, known as instances, then generally Bob and Jane will have an IAM user created inside the IAM service. But IAM users can also be used for applications. If you have a backup application, it might also use an IAM user to log into your account and do those backups. Next, we've got groups, and groups are just collections of related users. If you want to manage all development team users, you might create a development team group and add the IAM users to that group. Same for finance or HR. Then we've got IAM roles, and IAM roles are fairly tough to understand at first, but they can be used by AWS services or if you want to grant external access to your account. Now you'll see later in the course how you can use IAM roles to give an EC2 instance itself access to AWS services. Roles are generally used when you want to grant access to services in your account to an uncertain number of entities. So for example, if you want all EC2 instances in your account to be able to access the simple storage service, which I'll be covering soon, then you can create a role which grants access to the simple storage service and then allow instances to use that role. So generally you pick IAM users when you can identify the individual thing that will log in to that user. So if it's an individual person or an individual application, then generally you'll use users. Roles tend to get used when the number of things is uncertain. So if you want to grant users of external accounts access to, say, a simple storage service bucket, or if you want to grant an uncertain number of EC2 instances access to certain services in your account, or if you want to allow AWS services themselves to interact on your behalf, then you'll generally use a role. Now, it is really difficult to explain what a role does and when you'll use it by just covering the theory. So later in the course, I'm going to give you plenty of examples of the types of situations when you would and wouldn't use roles. Now, there's one more concept that I want you to be super clear on, and that is an IAM policy or a policy document. IAM lets you create these policies, which are essentially objects or documents, which can be used to allow or deny access to AWS services when and only when they're attached to IAM users, groups, or roles. So policies on their own do nothing. They simply define, allow, or deny rights to certain services. Only when you attach the policies to other identities, so users, groups, and roles, do they have any effect. Now, at a high level, IAM has three main jobs. Firstly, it's an identity provider, or an IDP. It lets you create, modify, and delete identities such as users and roles. And it also authenticates those identities. So when anyone attempts to make a request to AWS, they're known as a security principal. And what they need to do is to prove their identity. I might claim to be an IAM user called Adrian in my account, but I need to be able to prove this. And so IAM authenticates me. And generally, this is using a username or password. But as you'll see later in the course, there are other methods of authentication. Now, assuming I prove my identity, IAM then authorizes me or not to access AWS resources. So I'm either allowed or denied access to certain things. And this is based on policies associated with the identity that I authenticate with. Really try and remember these terms. So you've got an ID provider, which is a service that allows you to create and manage identities. You've got the authentication process, which is where you're challenged to prove that you are the identity that you're claiming to be. And then once you're authenticated, you become an authenticated identity, and then you're authorized or not to access AWS services. Now we're almost done. I just have a few points that I want you to remember, and then it's demo time. IAM is provided for free. There are no costs associated with creating users, groups, or roles. There are limits on how many of each you can have, and some of these limits actually matter for real-world usage and for the exam, so I'm going to go into more details on these later. IAM is a global service. It's got one global database for your account, and it's globally resilient, so it can cope with the failure of large sections of the AWS infrastructure. Now, IAM only controls what its identities can do. So IAM users or roles which you create in IAM. It allows or denies those identities to do things via policies. It doesn't allow direct control over external accounts or users, so you can't use IAM to control what an external user in an external account can do. IAM only controls local identities in your account. Lastly, IAM lets you make use of identity federation and multi-factor authentication. Now, don't be scared of these terms for now. Identity federation lets you take identities that you already have, for example, your business's Active Directory or web identities such as Facebook, Twitter, Google, and more, and then use these indirectly to access AWS resources. Don't worry about understanding it now, I just wanted to introduce the term, and I'll be covering it extensively later in the course, including some demos to let you experience it yourself. I've already showed you multi-factor authentication. We've added it to the account root user of the accounts that we've created. So when the account root user needs to log into that AWS account, they need to input the one-time password that's generated by the MFA application on our phones. And what you can see on the bottom right of your screen now is just an example of a physical MFA device. So this is a physical device that you carry with you along with your wallet and keys that would generate these one-time passwords that you'd need to use when you log in. Okay, so that's all of the IAM basic theory that I wanted to cover. It's demo time. Over the next few lessons, I'm going to show you how you can further secure your AWS accounts that you'll use for this course. I'm going to demo setting up IAM and creating an IAM admin user. Now, the reason we're going to do this is to create a second user that will have full permissions on the AWS account. So the IAM admin user in many ways is going to function just like the account root user, but it will use IAM. Now, the reason we're doing this is so that we can stop using the account root user. Remember, we only have one account root user, and it's not possible to restrict the permissions of this user. And so best practice is that it's only used to perform the initial account setup. Afterwards, we need to utilize IAM users rather than the account root user. So that's what I'm going to demonstrate. Now at this point, once we've got this IAM admin user, throughout the course, as we need additional identities, we'll use this IAM admin user to create those additional identities, which will be giving less permissions. So remember, it's always best practice to only give the permissions required to do a specific task. And so if I'm demonstrating a certain product or technology, generally we're going to be using an IAM user that has just enough access rights to perform that task. So just like we did with the account root user, we're going to create an IAM admin user in each of the course AWS accounts. So that's what's coming up next. So at this point, feel free to complete this video, and when you're ready, join me in the next for the demo.